Inside the numbers, new polls reveal Americans' attitude toward the impeachment of President Donald Trump. A personal look.
I cherish my Catholic upbringing. I cherish my Catholic education. It really was the foundation of my life and my faith.
Vice President Mike Pence tells EWTN News Nightly about the Trump administration's fight for religious freedom and his own upbringing as a Catholic. Fairness for All Act. We hear about a new proposal by lawmakers and why some worry about its impact on religious freedom. And lighting up the nation's capital. The President and First Lady participate in a Christmas tradition that's nearly 100 years old. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, December 6th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. House Democrats are moving aggressively to draw up formal articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump. The president and other leading Republicans call it a sham and a hoax. Democrats say it's their duty in the aftermath of the Ukraine probe, while Republicans say it will drive Pelosi's majority from office. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us with more. Jason?
Why Democrats won the House here in 2018 by flipping moderate districts. One of those, Jeff Van Drew in New Jersey, is against impeachment. He said it could tear the country apart. Another from New York, Max Rose, says he'll be uncomfortable until he sees the articles of impeachment, and now ads are targeting vulnerable Democrats.
He supported the partisan impeachment investigation.
A $7 million ad campaign targets swing state Democrats.
Tell Congressman Lamb, let the voters decide elections.
The 2020 Trump campaign manager says internal polling reveals the impeachment push is hurting Democrats. He tweets Nancy Pelosi is marching members of her caucus off the plank and into the abyss. Say goodbye to your majority, Nancy. But the speaker says she's not worried about losing the House over impeachment.
This has absolutely nothing to do with politics. It isn't about politics, partisanship, Democrats and Republicans. That's totally insignificant. It's about the Constitution of the United States, the oath of office we take to protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's about the president not honoring his oath of office.
The speaker earlier this year said impeachment had to be bipartisan. However, this push today falls on partisan lines. Republicans against Democrats.
They've had this planned all along. They were planning it before President Trump was ever inaugurated. So they've got their game plan. They're going to follow through with it, and I think it's really a sad day the way they're going about this.
I think America's cynicism with government and Congress gets even worse if this drags out any longer.
And President Trump seems to be coming around to the fact that the House will likely impeach him. He tweeted that if they are to impeach him, they should do it now. That will send it over to the Senate for a trial, and that Republican-controlled chamber is likely to acquit him. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. The Pentagon is considering sending several thousand additional troops to the Middle East to help deter Iranian aggression. It comes amid reports of escalating violence between the Iranian regime and protesters in the country. President Trump says the U.S. stands with the protesters. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Trump administration officials are reportedly considering sending between 5,000 and 7,000 troops to the region. President Trump isn't confirming anything, but he is expressing unity with the people of Iran.
America will always stand with the Iranian people in their righteous struggle for freedom.
President Trump says if a threat comes from Iran, it will be met with strongly. The Trump administration accuses Iranian security forces of killing more than 1,000 people in crackdowns against recent protests that have swept the country.
And there are people all over the country. They're rioting and they're protesting and they're very unhappy.
The U.S. has stepped up a maximum pressure campaign with sanctions on Iran after President Trump withdrew from the landmark 2015 nuclear deal last year. And this week, the State Department said Iranian people are protesting against the regime in response to gasoline price increases and rationing.
And as the truth is trickling out of Iran, it appears the regime could have murdered over 1,000 Iranian citizens since the protests began. Among those murdered are at least a dozen children, including 13 and 14-year-olds.
اردوغان جناب آقای پوتین حضار محترم
Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, has renewed calls for talks with the Trump administration. But first, he says sanctions must be lifted.
The maximum pressure policy is working.
Majid Sajpour with the Organization of Iranian American Communities tells us U.S. sanctions have been effective and the president's support for Iran's protesters is empowering.
The task of overthrowing the regime belongs to the people of Iran. I think the people of Iran and the streets of Iran have really said so. But it is important for the international community to express solidarity with their plight.
Today, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Kelly Craft warned Iran that the U.S. will keep up its maximum pressure campaign and use, quote, other tools if Tehran continues its malicious behavior. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Vice President Mike Pence tells EWTN he's grateful for his Catholic upbringing and education. I sat down with him for a one-on-one interview on Wednesday in Michigan, where I asked him wide-ranging questions, like what steps the administration will take next to ensure persecuted Christians are getting the help they need. Well, religious freedom is not just an important issue here in America, it's important around the world. Some religious freedom advocates are worried about the Christians in the Middle East and around the world. This is an issue I know you've been following for a long, long time. What more can be done, though, to push those bad actors, people like China, North Korea, Pakistan, to do more to protect religious minorities and those who are most vulnerable?
Well, our administration has taken a strong stand for religious liberty, whether it be Muslim Uyghurs in China, whether it be Christians across China, whether it be besieged Christians and Yazidi communities in the Nineveh Plain of northern Iraq and in Syria. This president, this administration have stood strong with persecuted religious minorities, particularly Christian persecuted minorities around the world. In Iraq, I'm particularly proud of the fact, Wyatt, that President Trump made a decision just a few short years ago to literally bypass traditional UN funding institutions and provide funding directly to Christian and religious-based non-governmental organizations that could help rebuild Christian communities, schools and churches in areas that have been decimated by the ISIS terrorists over the last 4 or 5 years. We've invested more than $130 million to help rebuild communities of Christians and Yazidis that were displaced by ISIS terrorism. And we'll continue to speak out. I mean, the voice of the United States of America is heard all over the world, and America stands for liberty. And so we'll continue to stand up, speak out, whether it's groups of people that are facing persecution, like those I mentioned, or whether it's individuals incarcerated. You'll continue to see this president speak out for religious liberty and to freeing those that are imprisoned because of their faith. And I have to tell you, the day that Pastor Andrew Brunson came home from Turkey, having been imprisoned in that country for years simply because of his Christian faith, meant a great deal to the American people. And President Trump stood strong until Pastor Brunson came home. And we'll continue to stand with all of those that are being persecuted for their faith around the world.
Mr. Vice President, I have one last thing I want to ask you. While you're here, I want to ask you about a personal question about your own faith. I know you were raised Catholic, you went to Catholic school. Sure. Can I ask you how your Catholic upbringing has influenced the way you think about faith and think about God to this day?
I grew up in a great big Catholic family. We had 4 boys in our family, and so when Father Gleason needed 4 altar boys, he knew to call my dad. And I cherish my Catholic upbringing. I cherish my Catholic education. It really was the foundation of my life and my faith. Later in my life, my faith became more personal to me. I made a personal decision for Christ when I was in college. But I have to tell you, I cherish that Catholic upbringing. I love attending Mass with my mom. I will always feel a great admiration and gratitude for the foundation of faith poured in my life by my parents in that Catholic upbringing.
Mr. Vice President, we appreciate your time. We know you have a busy schedule, so we appreciate your sitting down and talking with EWTN.
Great to see you, Wyatt.
At least 4 people, including the gunman, were killed in a shooting this morning at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. Authorities are investigating whether the attack was terror-related. The Navy says the base will remain closed until further notice. It is the second shooting at a naval base this week. Officials in Bosnia say they will close a makeshift migrant tent camp in the northwestern part of their country. Hundreds of refugees remain stranded in snow and freezing weather. Bosnia's security minister says the camp will be closed early next week and migrants will be relocated to other centers in the region. But some of those in the camp say that you do not want to be removed. Instead, they want to cross the border illegally into Croatia. Hundreds of demonstrators in Hong Kong demand police to stop using tear gas. Participants met in central Hong Kong. They expressed fears over possible health risks from the clouds of gas used by security to disperse demonstrators. Hong Kong police have fired more than 10,000 tear gas canisters to stop violent protests that have rocked the former British territory for 6 months. More bishops from the United States have been in Rome this week for their visit with Pope Francis at the Vatican. Dozens of church leaders met with the Holy Father and visited several Vatican departments. Similar visits are held once every 5 years. Today, the bishop celebrated Mass at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Bishop Robert Baker from the Diocese of Birmingham joins us from St. Paul outside the walls, one of the 4 major basilicas in Rome. Your Excellency, welcome in. You gave the homily at today's Mass. What was your message to the bishops?
Well, today is the final day of our ad limina visits from regions 5 and 4. We gathered just region 5 here at St. Paul's. Basically, it was having the sense that St. Paul sends us forth now this final day to share the gospel message and the importance of Paul in the life of all of us as Catholics, as Christians, and absorbing his message, which primarily is transformation in Christ, putting on the Lord Jesus. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. That is a kind of a central focus of the Bishops' Conference over the next 5 years around focusing on Christ with the theme of missionary discipleship. So I mentioned that and connected a little bit with the history of the new evangelization, starting with Pope St. Paul VI and Evangelii Nuntiandi, and then moving eventually into Pope Francis's message in Evangelii Gaudium, that all Catholics, all Christians are to be missionary disciples of Jesus. So the missionary discipleship thrust was in my homily. And I ended with carrying the theme of Isaiah, that we should all have hope, and that the bishops are ambassadors and missionaries of hope to the world. So we experienced this week kind of a sense of hope.
What is your biggest takeaway from meetings with Vatican officials and the Pope this week?
The dialogue was a very open-ended one, and I would say positive. And our meeting with the Pope was a beautiful meeting. Both regions 4 and 5 were together, so we had a massive group, about 45 bishops. But everybody had time because the Pope gave us about 2.5 hours of his time. And my one comment to him was thanking him for adding another Marian devotion. At Universal Church, we'll celebrate also Our Lady of Loretto's feast. And additionally, I commented on his adding the name St. Joseph to all the Eucharistic prayers, which I had in this Mass today. And I talked a little bit about the need for us to have St. Joseph in the picture of our church in the midst of all the scandals and troubles of family life and church life, to bring him back into that. Just wondering what he had to say about St. Joseph's role and how we can have a greater devotion to Joseph. And he said, we know it's the Holy Family we need today. And of course, he has a great devotion to our Blessed Mother, but he told us he also has a great devotion to St. Joseph, and he offers Mass, I think he said 5 times a year in honor of St. Joseph. So that devotion's already there. We just ask him for guidance on that, but the importance of Joseph in our lives, our personal lives, our faith lives, and our church life.
What do you think the church in the United States needs the most in this moment, this day and time?
Well, I think two things is a deep spirituality centered on Jesus Christ. I think the American bishops at the last meeting did approve the 5-year plan, which really focuses around deepening that personal relationship with Jesus. If that's missing, we will succeed in nothing, in anything at all. And also a zeal. I think we got to rekindle a zeal. Pope St. John Paul II talked about the new evangelization not being new in its message of salvation in Christ, but new in methods, expressions, and he said ardor or zeal. That's the hardest one for us to help our people get. But if that happens, then there'll be conversions, people return to the church in great numbers. And St. Paul, it was here at this Mass, we held him up as the model for how that goes about. And we know we have a long way to go, and we know the struggle's there. But I think we saw a commitment to trying to implement all the goals of the Charter and the follow-ups to that. We acknowledge our failures as bishops to do all that we should do, but there's a hopeful spirit after these ad limino visits that if we center and focus ourselves on Christ, it's not we who are going to save the church. We found that out quite easily. It's Jesus Christ. So, but we need the help of the angels and saints, and I think it's a spiritual quest principally that is needed for this renewal that has to take place, and it starts there and moves out from there. But also, we are being purified, and we are in a penitential time because of mistakes that have been made in the past. But there is hope.
A lot of really important ideas there, and we appreciate your coming on our program to talk about them and everything that has been going on this week. Bishop Robert Baker of the Diocese of Birmingham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wyatt. God bless you.
Coming up, the latest in the Archbishop Fulton Sheen beatification postponement. Tomorrow, Brother James Miller will become the first American-born Christian brother declared blessed. The ceremony, held in Guatemala, is a step on the road to becoming recognized as a saint. James Miller, a Lasallian Christian brother, was shot and killed in 1982 as he was mending a wall outside a school where he worked in Guatemala. He was 37 years old when he died. In 2018, Pope Francis recognized Brother James as a servant of God and a martyr for the faith, which set the path to beatification. We're learning more about the delay in the beatification of Archbishop Fulton Sheen. The Diocese of Rochester in New York confirmed yesterday that it requested the delay, writing it was, quote, prudent that Archbishop Sheen's cause receive further study and deliberation. Joining me now to take a closer look at this developing story is Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a canon lawyer. Ed, welcome back into the program.
Always a pleasure.
In its statement, the Diocese of Rochester writes, quote, there are no complaints against Archbishop Sheen engaging in any personal inappropriate conduct, nor were there any insinuations made in this regard. So what do you think is the delay behind this beatification, and what have you learned so far?
Well, I think at this point it's become fairly clear that the concerns around going ahead with the 21st of December beatification concerned mostly the Attorney General of New York's open investigation into all of the dioceses of that state, including, of course, Rochester, where Sheen was bishop for 3 years. Now, as you say, there's been no accusations against Sheen as having committed any personal misconduct of any kind, and no one is suggesting that is the case now. But it does appear that there are a number of priests who, had later accusations in Rochester who were active in ministry at the time of Fulton Sheen was bishop, and there was one in particular around which there is, shall we say, an unclear fact pattern of when he was removed from ministry, when he was eventually reinstated. It doesn't appear to anything that we've seen, and according to people we've spoken to in Rome and in Rochester and in Peoria for that matter, there doesn't seem to be any real question from the Vatican's point of view as to whether or not Sheen had done anything wrong. He seems to have behaved very impeccably with regards to how he handled it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we know what the Attorney General might say. Mm-hmm. And I think there was a concern, at least in Rome, and in Rochester, that if they went ahead with the 21st, the Attorney General in New York might take advantage of that situation to make a release, leak some information, make an announcement of some kind, and effectively upend the celebrations.
You mentioned the Diocese of Peoria in Illinois, which has long supported Archbishop Sheen's beatification. The ceremony had been scheduled, as you mentioned, December 21st until it was postponed indefinitely earlier this week. So then what are the next steps here, Ed? Is there anything concrete that we can look to?
Well, we don't really know when there will be any further progress in this. They've said postponed indefinitely. There's no expectation of a new date anytime soon. I think given that there seems to be a very strong correlation between the ongoing investigations in New York, the open window of the statute of limitations for bringing civil and criminal prosecutions, even from decades previously, that's open in that state right now, I think we're looking at probably until that window closes and after the Attorney General reports. Again, none of this is to suggest that anyone thinks there's anything that's been done wrong by Archbishop Sheen, but as we saw in the wake of the Pennsylvania grand jury report in 2018, a large report can raise a number of questions, many of them not necessarily related to one bishop or another, but it can cast a long shadow, and in the end, that's not what we want with this beatification.
I appreciate you saying that because I want to sort of follow up on that and ask you about how significant is this delay, do you think, and what impact do you think this is going to have on the faithful, so many of whom still watch Archbishop Sheen on this channel?
Well, there's no question that the faithful in Peoria and more widely across the United States are very, very upset about this delay. Archbishop Sheen's cause has been championed very vocally for a number of years now. There have been miracles attributed to his intercession. People were really looking forward to this. You know, people bought plane tickets. They were ready to go to Peoria. And I think a lot of people are going to be very disappointed, very frustrated with this decision to delay. But at the same time, you know, we can't necessarily expect the Vatican to rush into it if they're worried that there might be another problem with relation to the release of an Attorney General report. When I was speaking to someone in Rome close to the Vatican Secretariat of State, which made the decision to postpone, he offered me the counterexample of Cardinal John Henry Newman, who was recently canonized. He said, you know, that was a man who had a sort of equally popular public cause for sanctity. People wanted to see his process advance, but it still took about a century for it to go through. And in Fulton Sheen's case, we're seeing it move already at very quick speed. So I think a little delay, while frustrating for a lot of people, we don't need to read too much into it at this point.
Okay, sounds like a lot of people are doing their due diligence at this point. Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.
A Republican pitches what he calls a compromise bill to protect those who identify as same-sex attracted. It would also grant religious exemptions. Utah's Chris Stewart introduced his measure, the Fairness for All Act.
For those who are people like myself, people of faith who are concerned about the erosion of religious liberty and religious freedom, it codifies and cements in some of those protections.
But some are voicing concerns over the measure. Catholic scholar Dr. Ryan Anderson warns this will allow the federal government to use our civil rights laws as a sword to punish citizens who dissent from the reigning sexual orthodoxy. A bill that was truly fair would explicitly say that no institution could be forced by the government to allow boys who identify as girls to compete against girls in athletics. Up next, the Pope's preacher gives his first Advent reflection to the Holy Father, and a light moment in the nation's capital.
Nell'autostrada del profitto che obbliga a marciare sempre nella corsia del sorpasso.
Pope Francis tells Italy's National Notary Fund to have respect for the dignity and the rights of its clients. In a meeting at the Vatican, the Holy Father calls notaries the guardians of justice and charity. A notary public can do everything from verifying signatures to guaranteeing a legal contract is valid. Earlier today, the Holy Father took some time to reflect on the life of Mary, the Mother of God. Father Raniero Cantalamessa, the Capuchin friar who led the Advent reflection, says we can prepare for Christmas by looking at the example of the Blessed Virgin Mary. He pointed to three parts of her life: the Annunciation, the Visitation, and the Nativity. Father Cantalamessa gave the talk to the Holy Father and other heads of Vatican departments. Finally tonight, we end with something on a more lighter note. Last night, President Trump and First Lady lit the national Christmas tree.
We remember this eternal truth. Every person is a beloved child of God. As one grateful nation, we praise the joy of family, the blessings of freedom, and the miracle of Christmas. On behalf of Melania and our entire family, Merry Christmas and God bless you all.
The 30-foot tree has more than 50,000 lights. Presidents have lit a national Christmas tree for nearly a century. And before we go, be sure to tune in to EWTN News Nightly next week. We'll be launching an exclusive poll in partnership with Real Clear Opinion Research, examining the Catholic vote leading up to the 2020 election. We'll have a breakdown of all the results and expert analysis starting Monday. And with that, we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. We'll leave you with some more images from yesterday's tree lighting ceremony in the nation's capital. Good night, and God bless.
1.